Hi everyone, so here we are again. Chapter 27. No calm before the storm. Skulduggery had given her money and Stephanie had gone in to pay while he refilled the Bentley's tank. As she waited for a change, she looked at the chocolate bars on display and tried remembering the last time she'd eaten chocolate. She always ate chocolate when something bad had happened, but these days chocolate just wasn't enough. Everything was going wrong. Tanith was injured, Ghastly was nothing more than a statue, and now they had the white cleaver to worry about. It was getting to the point where Stephanie didn't know why they were bothering to fight any more. Although she'd never say that to Skulduggery, he seemed to think she was like him, never give up, never surrender. But she wasn't. The only reason she didn't tell him this was because she liked the way he thought of her, and she didn't want to disappoint him. But the truth was that the Valkyrie Kane he thought he knew was a lot stronger than Stephanie Edgley could ever be. She walked back outside. Skulduggery was fluttering the petrol nozzle back into the pump. Tanith had gone to soak her hand in the same healing mixture she'd given Steph. Now that they were alone, Stephanie didn't quite know what to say. Skulduggery screwed the petrol cap shut and stood there, perfectly still, his hat on and his scarf hiding his jaw. It could have been a mannequin standing there for all the difference it made. "I'm sorry," Stephanie said. He looked at her. "If it wasn't for me, Ghastly he'd be with us. It's my fault he's had to use his earth power. How long will he stay like that, do you think?" Skulduggery took a moment. "I sincerely don't know, Valkyrie. It's the most unpredictable power we have. It could be stuck as a statue for a day, a week, or 100 years. There's no way of knowing." "I've ruined everything." "No. That cleaver was after me. Ghastly wasn't forced to do anything," Skulduggery interrupted. "It were his choice, and it weren't your fault. Sir Pine sent his assassin after you to hurt me. It's what he does." "He sent him after me because he knew I wouldn't be able to defend myself. He knows you're looking after me. He knows I'm your weak spot." Skulduggery tilted his head. "Looking after you? Is that how you see this? You think I'm babysitting you?" "Well, aren't you? I've got no magic. I can't fight. I can't throw fire or run on ceilings. What use am I to you? I'm weak." Skulduggery shook his head. "No, you're not. You ain't trained in magic or combat, but you're not weak. Sir Pine underestimates you. Everyone underestimates you. You're stronger than you know. You're stronger than you know." "I wish you were right." "Of course I'm right. I'm me." Stephanie heard a phone ring as Tanith walked into the light of the forecourt. She'd wrapped a bandage around her wrist. The magical properties of the healing mixture would already be working to reduce the swelling and mend the damage. Tanith held her phone to her ear. Stephanie didn't like the way her face seemed to slacken as she listened to whatever was being said. She hung up without replying. "Skulduggery," she said softly. "You have your phone on?" "Battery's low," he said. "They've been trying to contact you, the administrator, the sanctuary." "Why? What wrong?" "The elders," Tanith said, her voice empty. "Sagacious tomes betrayed them. The elders are dead." Stephanie's hand was at her mouth. "Oh, God." "Tome's been working with Sir Pine all along. He's a traitor, like Mr. Bliss. All traitors, Skulduggery. What are we going to do?" Stephanie looked at him, praying that he'd come up with a great new plan, a scheme to ensure victory and a happy ending, but he didn't answer. "Do you hear me?" Tanith continued, the emptiness in her voice giving way to sudden anger. "Are you even listening? Do you even care? Maybe you don't. Maybe you want to die again. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you want to join your wife or your child, but hey, what? We don't want to die, okay? I don't. Valkyrie doesn't." Skulduggery just stood there, a mannequin, silent. "Do you think we stand a chance against Sir Pine? Tome, Bliss, Cleaver? Do you think we can stand a chance against them all?" "What do you just suggest we do?" Skulduggery said. "Stand back and let Sir Pine grow stronger. Stand back and let him recruit more allies. Let them open the door and let the faceless ones come through." "He's winning, okay? Sir Pine is winning this war. No such thing." "What?" "There's no such thing as winning or losing. There is won and there is lost. There is a victory and defeat. There are absolutes. Everything in between is still left to fight for. Sir Pine will have won only when there is no one left to stand against him. Until then, there is only the struggle, because tides do what tides do. They turn. This is insane." He turned to her so sharply Stephanie thought he might strike her. "I've seen my friend, a very dear friend, turn into a statue, Tanith. Meritorious and Crow, two of the few people in this world I respected, have been murdered. So yes, you're right when you say our allies are dropping like flies, but this was never going to be an easy fight. Casualties are to be expected, and you know what to do. We step over them and we move on because we don't have another choice. Now I'm going to stop Serpine once and for all. Anyone who wants to come with me, they're welcome. Anyone who doesn't, it won't make a blind bit of difference. Serpine will be stopped. And that's all there is to it. He got into his Bentley and started the engine. Stephanie hesitated, opened the door and slid in. She glanced at Skulduggery as she buckled up, but he was staring straight ahead. He waited 3 seconds, put the car into gear and was about to drive off when Tanith got in behind them. "No need to get all dramatic about it now, is there?" she muttered, and Stephanie managed to smile. Skulduggery pulled out onto the road, driving fast. "Where are we going?" Stephanie asked. "Weren't you listening?" Skulduggery responded. "We're going to stop Serpine. I just made a whole speech about it. It were very good." Tanith forward. "You know where he is?" "Yeah, I do. It came to me just when I were filling up the tank." "What did?" "The sceptre." "Why did Serpine go after the sceptre?" Stephanie frowned. "Because it's the ultimate weapon." "And why do you want it?" "Do you know, to retrieve the ritual, he needs to bring back the faceless ones back to the Force, whoever knows it to tell him." "No, he isn't going to use it to retrieve the ritual. The sceptre's too clumsy, too unwieldy. If he threatens to kill the only person in the world who knows how to work the ritual, what if that person chooses death rather than to hand you over? What's he supposed to do then? No, he's used the sceptre to kill the elders. That's the only reason he wanted it. He knew he wasn't powerful enough to take them on without it. And so how does that help him retrieve the ritual? This isn't just about the ritual anymore. What do you get if you kill the elders?" This sounds like a joke. "Valkyrie?" "I don't know." "Yeah, you do. Now think, what would killing the elders result in?" "Panic, fear, 3 empty parking spaces in the sanctuary." Skulduggery looked at her and Stephanie's confusion lifted. "Oh, God," she said. "He's after Buck," Skulduggery said. "He needed the sceptre to kill Meritorious and Morena Crow in order to dismantle the spell protecting it. He doesn't have to force anyone to do anything, and all he has to do is ask. He's been after the Book of Names all along." Chapter 28. Carnage. Dublin City was quiet when they reached the Waxworks Museum, as if it was holding its breath. The stars were obscured by a veil of dark clouds, and as they left the Bentley and approached the rear entrance, the rain fell steadily. On the street beyond the gates, cars splashed through puddles, and the occasional pedestrian hurried by with his head down. Skulduggery moved quickly but cautiously up to the open door, and Stephanie and Tanith followed. Stephanie had expected to arrive in the middle of a pitched battle. She expected to hear the sounds of fighting, but the waxworks was silent, and as they walked through the exhibits to the hidden door, Skulduggery slowed and eventually came to a complete stop. "What's wrong?" Stephanie whispered. He turned his head, slowly peering into the darkness. "I don't want to alarm anybody, but we're not alone." That's when they came, the hollow men, detaching themselves from the shadows with only the faintest rasps of warnings. In an instant they were surrounded by the mindless, heartless, soulless things. Tanith waded through them, her sword strokes deliberate and devastating, every move claiming another unlife. Skulduggery clicked his fingers, and a group of hollow men were suddenly alight. Stephanie shrank back as they wheeled around blindly. Flames ate through skin and ignited a putrid gas inside, and with a burst of fire and heat, hollow men fell. One of them avoided the flames and lunged at Stephanie, and as she punched it square in the face, her fist sinking into its head slightly, its own fist swung at her, and she ducked, then moved into it like she'd seen Skulduggery do, jammed her hip into it and twisted, and the hollow man hit the ground. It wasn't graceful or pretty, but it worked. While it was down there, she grabbed its wrist and stomped on its chest, and with a loud tear, she pulled its arm off. As the hollow man deflated beneath her, Stephanie realised everything had gone quiet again. She looked up at Skulduggery and Tanith, realised they'd been watching her. "Not bad," Tanith said, an eyebrow raised. "That last of them," Skulduggery said. "Now for the main event." The hidden door to the sanctuary hung open like a gaping wound. A dead cleaver lay just inside. Stephanie hesitated for a moment and stepped over the body. The sanctuary's foyer had witnessed most of the carnage. It was littered with the dead. There were no wounded here, there were no dying, only corpses. Some had been cut to ribbons, some were unmarked, and there were places spread across the floor where there were only dust of those who had fallen before the sceptre. Stephanie tried to step without touching the remains, but they were piled so deep that this was impossible. She passed the administrator, his body curled, his fingers hooked and frozen in death, his face a mask of agony, a victim of Serpine's right red hand. Skulduggery went to the corridor on the left and peered around, making sure it was empty. Tanith passed, pressing herself against the wall and nodding to him. He moved forward, stopped, nodded back to her, and they continued like this as they stalked deeper into the sanctuary. Stephanie followed along behind, her palms slick with sweat and her mouth dry. She felt as if her legs weren't going to support her for much longer. Her thoughts went to her parents, her loving parents. If she died here, tonight, would they even notice? Her reflection would carry on with its empty masquerade, and they'd gradually begin to realise that this thing they thought was their daughter, its affections weren't even real. They'd realise it was all an act, but they'd still think it was her, and they'd live out the rest of their days thinking that their own daughter didn't love them. Stephanie didn't want to put them through that. She was going to die. She knew she was. She should turn now and run away. This wasn't her business. This wasn't her world. It was like Ghastly said, the first time she met him. Gordon had already lost his life because of this nonsense. Was she so keen to join him? She didn't hear him. She didn't hear his footsteps. Not even when he was so close she could have reached out and stroked her hair. She didn't catch a glimpse out of the corner of her eye, and she didn't notice his shadow or see a reflection, because if he didn't want to be seen, he wouldn't be seen. But as he was moving behind her, she felt his presence. She felt the air shift slightly and brush against the skin of her hands, and she didn't even have to turn her head. She just knew. She launched herself forward, and Skulduggery and Tanith looked back as she rolled and came up. The white cleaver stood there, silent as a ghost, deadly as the plague. Tanith turned to see Valkyrie coming up out of her roll and saw the white cleaver standing behind her. "Valkyrie," Tanith said, keeping her voice low and steady. "Get behind me." Tanith moved backwards and the cleaver attempted to stop her. "I'll hold him off. You stop Zerbine." Tanith drew her sword and she heard Skulduggery and Stephanie hurry away. The white cleaver reached over his shoulder and pulled out a scythe. Tanith stepped towards him. "I ordered you to distract the Hollow Men, didn't I?" she said. "You were one of the cleavers assigned to us." He didn't answer. He didn't even move. "For what it's worth," Tanith said, "I'm sorry about what happened to you, but it was necessary. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry for what is going to happen to you, but that's necessary too." He started twirling his scythe and she raised an eyebrow. "Come and have you go if you think you're hard enough." He lunged and she blocked and sprang at him, her sword slicing through the air. He ducked back and blocked, spinning as a scythe whistled over Tanith's head. Her sword clashed with his blade and the handle of the scythe, and his blade clashed with her sword, and then the lacquered scabbard she still held in her left hand. She ducked under his guard, staying in close where she had the advantage and where he couldn't manoeuvre the scythe. His blocks were lightning fast, but he was on the defensive, and one of her strikes would get through eventually. Her sword sliced through his side, and he stumbled back out of range. Tanith looked at the blood on his white coat and gave him a smile. Then the blood started to darken, and a black stain moved over the red. Her smile dropped, and the bleeding stopped altogether. She backed away. There was a door behind her, and she waved it open as the cleaver advanced. The room she backed into was filled with cages, and in these cages men and women stood and sat. She realised instantly where she was, the sanctuary's jail. The people in these cages were the worst of the worst, criminals of such sickening and grotesque order that they had to be held here in the sanctuary itself. The cages bound their powers while at the same time sustaining their bodies, keeping them healthy and nourished. It meant neither the elders nor the cleavers had to bring them food nor water. Criminals only had themselves for company, and when the person in the cage next to each of them was as maniacal and as egotistical as they were, that was hell itself. The cleaver pursued her steadily down the steps, sparks flying as their blades clashed. Prisoners watched, and for the first few moments they were confused. Cleavers were their jailers, yet this cleaver wore white, and they recognised something within him, something that identified him as one of their own. They started to shout and cheer as Tanith was forced back, enemies all around her. The prisoners laughed and jeered, reaching through the cage bars at her, pulling at her hair, trying to scratch her. One of them snagged her coat and she spun out of it. Throwing her sword and scabbard into the air, she freed her arms from the sleeves and catching them again before the cleaver could close the gap. She swung and she blocked with the scabbard and flicked up the sword while he was twisting the scythe, deflecting the strike and coming back with one of his own. Tanith dodged back, losing her footing, and went into a backwards roll as she brought the scythe down, point of the blade striking the ground where she had just been. The prisoners howled with laughter as she turned and ran to the wall, the cleaver right behind her. She jumped to the wall and kept going till she was upside down, and she crossed the ceiling, trading strikes with the cleaver below. She was forced to walk backwards to defend and attack over his own head. The cleaver slashed and missed, and she saw her chance and took it. She struck his left hand with her scabbard, and his fingers opened. She dropped and flipped, landing before he could recover, and snatched the scythe from his grasp. She kicked out, and he stumbled back, and she drove her sword into him. The prisoners stopped jeering. The cleaver took a step back. Tanith swung the scythe, burying the blade deep into his chest. He fell to his knees, black blood dripping onto the floor. She looked down at him, felt his eyes through his visor looking back at her. Then his weight fell back onto his haunches, his shoulders sagged, and his head lolled forward. The prisoners were muttering now, cheated out of seeing her die. Tanith gripped her sword and pulled it from the cleaver's body, snatched up the scabbard and ran for the steps. She heard a crash from somewhere else in the sanctuary, and urgency lent her speed. As she neared the top step, however, one of the prisoners laughed. She turned, and to her horror saw the white cleaver standing, pulling the scythe from her chest. "He can't be stopped," she said to herself. "Just like Serpine, he can't be stopped." She ran the last few steps to the door, and just as she reached it, the breath went out of her. She stopped, frowning, willing her body to move, but it wouldn't listen. She looked down at the tip of the scythe that protruded through her chest. She turned, cursing, saw the cleaver walking up the steps towards her. That was some throw. She almost laughed. Her right arm was numb, and her sword fell from her grip. He stepped up beside her and took hold of the scythe. He circled, moving her around, looking at her like he was observing her pain, remembering what it was like. A twist of his hands, and she was forced to her knees. She gasped when he removed the weapon, saw her own blood, deep red, mixed with the black blood already on the blade, her body shutting down. She wasn't going to be able to defend herself. He raised the scythe. Tanith looked up, ready to die, then realised that when he had circled her, he had passed through the doorway and was now standing out in the corridor. She lunged, slamming the door in his visored face. She pressed her hand against the door and whispered, "Withstand." The sheen spread over the door just as the cleaver began to pound on it from the other side. She had failed. She'd slowed him down, but she hadn't stopped him, and now Serpine had his attack dog back. Tanith tried standing, but her body couldn't take any more. She slumped to the ground. The prisoners watched from their cages with delighted eyes. As her blood seeped through her tunic, they started whispering. Deep in Dublin Death, Chapter 29. The white cleaver stood there, silent as a ghostly death, deadly as the plague. "Valkyrie," Tanith said, "get behind me." Stephanie backed up until she was beside Skulduggery. "I'll hold him off," Tanith said. "You stop Serpine." She drew her sword. The cleaver drew the scythe. Stephanie felt Skulduggery touch her arm, and they moved off. "You're going to have to go after the sceptre," Skulduggery whispered as they jogged through the corridor. "You can get close to it." "I can't. It's not much of a plan. Sometimes simplicity is the way to go." The repository was just ahead. They slowed, and Skulduggery gripped both her arms and turned to her. "But you listen to me. If it goes wrong, if we lose the element of surprise, I want you to get out of here. No matter what happens to me, I want you to run. Do you understand?" Stephanie hesitated. He said, "Serpine used my wife and child as a weapon against me. In order to do so, he had me to kill him. He took my family's death and he made it about me. Valkyrie, when you die, it will be your death and yours alone. Let it come to you on your own terms. Valkyrie Kane, it has been an absolute pleasure knowing you." She looked back at him. "You too." If he'd had lips, she knew he'd be smiling. They sneaked up to the doors. They were already open, and Stephanie could see Serpine, the sceptre in his hand and his back to them, taking slow, deliberate steps towards the Book of Names. Sagacious Tome was watching, but he too had his back to the doors. "I can't see Mr. Bliss," Stephanie whispered. Skulduggery shook his head. Neither could he. Stephanie hesitated, then passed into the repository and crept to the left. She reached a heavy table laden with artifacts and peered around. Serpine had stopped walking, and for a moment she thought he knew she was there, but as she watched, he turned and walked back, shaking his head. "It's still too strong," he said. "It's as weak as it's going to get," Sagacious Tome said. "I thought with Tories and Marina dead, the barrier wouldn't pose a problem, but I can't withdraw my contribution to the spell, not without the others joining me in the ceremony." Serpine rejoined, Tome arching an eyebrow. "Then perhaps we should have killed them." "I didn't kill them," Tome said defensively. "You did." Stephanie stayed low as she crept from behind the table. Serpine laughed. "I may have been the one to turn them to dust, but you set them up, Sagacious. You drew them in. You betrayed them." Tome spun on Serpine. "No, I didn't. It was their weakness that led them to their downfall, their own shortcomings. They had all this power, and they were satisfied to just sit there and let it all go to waste. Until recently, I never thought of you as ambitious." No one had. "Sagacious Tome," they said. "He's a non-entity. He's not the strongest. He's the wisest. He's nothing." That's what they said. I know it. For years, people have been underestimating me. It's time people recognise my power. Stephanie got to her hands and knees and started crawling. She was in shadow and they weren't looking her way, but if either turned, there was a chance they would see her. Stephanie wasn't in the mood to take chances. "I'm going to make them pay," Tome was saying. "Everyone who ever questioned me, the streets will run red with their blood." How dramatic, Sturpine said, and raised his hand. Stephanie saw the book lift off its pedestal and hover there for a moment. Then he grunted impatiently and let it drop again. I told you that won't work, Tome said. It's how close you are getting to it. It doesn't have to be physically close. It isn't a physical barrier. It's a mental one. Stephanie held her breath. She was behind the pillar next to them. Serpine's voice was so close she could have been speaking right into her ear. So with you, the final elder remaining the barrier isn't sufficiently weakened to let me through. Is that right? Yes, but that's not my fault. I did what I could. Yes, you did. And there's one more thing you can do to help solve the problem. What are you talking about? Tome asked, and then his tone changed suddenly, becoming afraid. What are you doing? Point that thing somewhere else, Serpine. I'm warning. Point that... There was a black flash and silence. After a moment, she heard Serpine's footsteps move off again, and Stephanie took a peek. He was walking slowly, concentrating on the book, his back to her. This was the only chance she was going to get. She crept out from behind the pillar, ignoring the fresh pile of dust at her feet. There was no way she could close the distance without giving herself away. He'd hear her, sense her, whatever. But he was holding the sceptre in his hand so loosely. Stephanie narrowed her eyes and stepped forward. He had heard her and was turning. She didn't care. The sceptre was coming up, the black crystal starting to glow. She flexed her fingers and splayed her hand, snapping open her palm and pushing out the air. And the space around her hand rippled, and the sceptre flew from Serpine's grasp, flew away from them both and hit the far wall. Serpine hissed in anger and turned. They heard the sceptre starting to sing as Skulduggery sprinted in. He dived into the air, and the space around him shimmered as he shot forward. He covered the distance in a blink of an eye, crashing into Serpine, taking him off his feet. Serpine lunged, but Skulduggery snagged his wrist and stepped in, and then under his arm. He turned and wrenched, and Serpine yelled in pain, and a loud crack echoed through the chamber. Serpine tried gathering purple vapour in his hand, but Skulduggery battered the hand away, chopped into the side of his neck. Serpine gagged and dropped him back, and Skulduggery kicked his leg out from under him. You never could fight, damn, Skulduggery said. But when you didn't need to, did you? Not when you had your lackeys to do your fighting for you. Where are your lackeys now, Nefarian? I don't need them, Serpine muttered. I don't need anyone. I shall crush you myself, grind your bones to dust. Skulduggery tilted his head. Unless you've got an army tucked away in that fancy coat of yours, I sincerely doubt it. Serpine scrambled up and rushed at him, but Skulduggery drove in a kick and brought his closed fist down onto his shoulders, and Serpine fell to his knees. With him on his knees, his lips were moving, and the wall behind Skulduggery came alive with hands that reached out and grabbed him. Skulduggery was pulled back, and Serpine stood. There were a series of dull cracks and pops as Serpine's broken bones mended and realigned. Where are your oh-so-clever taunts now, detective? Skulduggery struggled against the grip of a dozen hands. You got big ears, he managed to say before he was pulled even further back into the wall, and then he was gone. Serpine looked over, saw Stephanie, saw how close she was to the sceptre. He snapped out his hand, and a thin purple tendril whipped towards the sceptre. He pulled back his arm, and the sceptre flew off the ground, but Stephanie lunged and managed to grab it. She was jerked off her feet, but her grip was strong, and the tendril broke, becoming vapour, and she hit the floor. She heard a crash and looked around as the table hurtled straight towards her. She tried to dive out of the way, but she wasn't quick enough. It hit her, and she screamed, dropped the sceptre, and clutched her broken leg. She shut her eyes against the tears of pain, and when she opened them, Mr. Bliss walked into the room. Where have you been? Snapped Serpine. Delayed, Mr. Bliss answered, but you seem to have done fine without me. Serpine narrowed his eyes. Indeed. Still, there's one more adversary to deal with. Mr. Bliss looked at Stephanie. You're going to kill her? Me? No, you are. I'm sorry. If you want to reap the rewards of this night, you have to get your hands a little bloody. You want me to kill an unarmed child? Look on it as a test of your commitment to our lords and masters. You don't have a problem with that, do you? Mr. Bliss looked at him coolly. Do you have a weapon for me, or do you want me to just beat her with death with a large stick? Serpine took a dagger from his coat and lobbed it over to Mr. Bliss. He snatched it out of the air and held it, testing its weight. Stephanie felt her throat go dry. Mr. Bliss looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just sighed and hurled the dagger, and Stephanie made a face and turned her head, and heard Serpine laugh. She looked back. The dagger hadn't touched her. It hadn't even come close. It was in Serpine's hand. He'd caught it before it had sliced into his glittering left eye. I thought as much. Mr. Bliss flung himself at Serpine, but Serpine ripped his glove off and raised his red right hand, and Mr. Bliss collapsed. No doubt you want to kill me, Serpine said as he approached. No doubt you want to rip me from limb to limb. And with your legendary strength, I know you could do it and not even exert yourself. But answer me this, Mr. Bliss. What good is a legendary strength when you can't even get close enough to use it? Mr. Bliss tried to stand, but his knees gave out and he hit the ground again. I'm curious, Sir Pine continued. Why the pretense? Why go to all this trouble? Why put yourself in this position? Why didn't you just stick with a detective? Mr. Bliss managed to shake his head. We mightn't have been able to stop you, he said. I know you, Sir Pine. You always have plans to fall back on. You were too dangerous, too unpredictable. I needed you to get to the sceptre. And why was that? Mr. Bliss echoed that smile with one of his own, albeit a strained and sickly version. Because once you had the sceptre, I could predict your actions. So you predicted my invulnerability, Sir Pine laughed. Oh, well done. No one is invulnerable, Mr. Bliss whispered. Yes, well, Sir Pine said with a shrug. You're certainly not. Stephanie watched in horror as Sir Pine again pointed his right hand and Mr. Bliss contorted in agony. His screams reached new heights, and just when it seemed like he could not take any more, Sir Pine picked him up and, with his hands pressed against him, gathered the purple vapour in his fist. Mr. Bliss was blasted backwards through the air into a group of shelves at the side of the room. He didn't get up. Sir Pine turned back to Stephanie. So sorry for the interruption, he said as he picked her up. His hands gripped the lapels of her coat and he lifted her off her feet, looking up at her as he spoke. Her right leg dangled uselessly, and that pain was all she felt. How did you do it? How did you get so close without the sceptre alerting me? Some magic I don't know? Miss Kane, I know you're trying to hide it, but I can see the fear in your eyes. You don't want to die today, do you? If only you'd kept out of all of this, if only you'd left the death of your uncle alone, you wouldn't be here right now. Your uncle was a very stubborn man. If he'd just given me the key when I'd asked, you wouldn't be in any of this predicament. He delayed my plans. You see, he caused a lot of unnecessary stress. Stephanie twisted her face. Don't you dare blame my uncle for all the people you've killed. I didn't want this. I didn't want conflict. I just wanted to eliminate the elders and take the book. Do you see how simple that would have been? Instead, I had to wade through a river of corpses. Those deaths are on your uncle's head. But you don't have to join them, Miss Kane. You can survive this. You can live. I see something in you. I think you'd like the new world that's coming. Oh, I wouldn't bet on it, Stephanie said. Sir Payne smiled patiently and leaned his face in close. You can survive if you tell me how you got so close to the sceptre without alerting me. With no weapons left, Stephanie spat on him. He sighed and threw her against the pillar. She smacked into it and her body twisted and she dropped onto her back. Her eyes couldn't focus. The pain was too far away. She heard his voice like there was a wall separating them. No matter. I was about to make slaves of the entire population of this planet, and there will be no more secrets, there will be no more magic hidden from me, and when the faceless ones return, this world will be remade as a place of splendid darkness. He passed her a vague shape in the corner of her eye. She had to get up, snap out of it, this pain from a broken leg. Let it in. It was nothing more than a sensation now. Allow it to flood her. She focused on her leg, throbbing, the pain spiking, and with each new height it reached her mind, sharpened a little. She looked up. Sir Pine was approaching the books. Stephanie gripped the edge of the tabletop and pulled herself up onto her good leg. She grabbed the first thing she saw, a green vial, and threw it. It hit Sir Pine in the back and shattered, and the liquid turned to vapour and dissipated into the air. He spun around. You, my dear, have proven yourself to be far too troublesome for your own good. He raised his red hand, and from somewhere behind her she heard the sceptre singing again, and then Skulduggery dropped through the ceiling. Ah, I'm back. You are, Sir Pine said, and Skulduggery looked up and saw him. Sir Pine lashed a kick into Skulduggery's side, and Skulduggery grunted. He tried to get up, but Sir Pine battered his hands away and grabbed his skull, driving a knee into the back of Skulduggery's head. Sir Pine looked over to Stephanie and then to the ground behind her, and she turned, saw the sceptre, lunged for it, but its purple tendril wrapped itself around her waist, and her pain yanked back through her leg. Sir Pine whipped the tendril to the sceptre, yanked it into his left hand, and whirled, the crystal flashing with a black light that streaked towards Skulduggery. The detective dived as a whole section of the wall behind him turned to dust. Shh! Still with that little toy of yours. How quaint! Skulduggery circled him. Sir Pine held the sceptre down by his side. You'll be stopped, Skulduggery said. You've always been stopped. Oh, my old foe, but this is so different. Those days are gone. Who is there to rise up against me? Who is left? Remember when you were a man? A real man, I mean? Not this mockery I see before me. We wanted to bring the faceless ones back, to worship them as the gods that they are. You wanted to keep them out, so that this infestation of humanity, the celebration of the mundane, might be allowed to live and thrive. Well, they've lived and they've thrived, and now their time is up. Skulduggery's finger tightened on the trigger. Black blood sprayed from Serpine's chest, and the wound instantly healed. You have caused me so much trouble over the years, Detective. It's almost a shame that I have to end it now. Skulduggery cocked his head. You're surrendering? I'm going to miss this, Serpine. It makes it any easier. You can think of your imminent size as a good thing. I don't think you'll much like the world once my lords and I don't think you'll like the world once my lords and masters remake it. So how are you going to kill me? Skulduggery asked, dropping his gun. With your toy or with one of those new tricks you've learnt? Serpine smiled. I have been expanding my repertoire, so good of you to notice. And I see you've been playing around with necromancy again. Indeed. My very own pet cleaver. Every home should have one. I'm going to have to leave it there because I have to go and do spelling shed. I'll see you in a bit.